Good evening, and welcome to Narnia by the Fire, as we read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, with permission from HarperCollins Children's Books. Our reading will last the next half hour. Now, let's step into the wardrobe.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me as we read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. This evening we're going to be reading chapter 7 and chapter 8. And I wonder if you can remember what happened last time. The children are following the robin, wondering where they're going. So let's see what happens next. Chapter 7. A Day with the Beavers. While the two boys were whispering behind both of the girls, they suddenly cried, "Oh!" and stopped. "The robin!" cried Lucy. The robin, it's flown away." And so it had, right out of sight. "And now what are we to do?" said Edmund, giving Peter a look which was as much to say, "What did I tell you?" "Shh! Look," said Susan. "What?" said Peter. "There's something moving in the trees over there on the left." They all stared as hard as they could, and no one felt very comfortable at all. "There it goes again," said Susan. "Yeah, and I saw it that time," said Peter. "It's still there. Look, it's just gone behind the big tree." "What is it?" asked Lucy, trying hard not to sound nervous. "Whatever is it?" said Peter. "It's dodging us. It's something that doesn't want to be seen." "Let's go home," said Susan. And then, though nobody said it out loud, everybody realised the same fact that Edmund had whispered to Peter at the end of the last chapter, that they realised they were lost. "What's it like?" said Lucy. It's some kind of an animal," said Susan. "And then, look, there it is." And they all saw it this time. A whiskery, furry face, which had looked out at them from behind the tree, but this time it didn't immediately draw back. Instead, the animal put its paw against its mouth, just as humans do put their finger against their lips when they're signalling you to be quiet, and then it disappeared again. The children all stood holding their breath. A moment later, the stranger came out from behind the tree and glanced around as if it were afraid someone were watching. And then it said, "Hush," and made signs to join them in the thicker bit of the wood where it was standing, and then once more it disappeared. "I don't know what it is." "Actually, I know what it is. It's a beaver. I saw the tail." "Look, it wants us to go with it," said Susan, "and it's warning us not to make a noise." "Well, I know," said Peter. "The question is, are we to go or not? What do you think, Lou?" "Well, I think it's a nice beaver," said Lucy. "Yes, but how do we know?" said Edmund. "Well, shan't we have to risk it?" said Susan. "I mean, it's no good just standing here, and I feel like I want some dinner." At this, the beaver again popped its head out from behind the tree and beckoned them earnestly. "Come on," said Peter, "let's give it a try. All keep close together. We ought to be a match for one beaver if it turns out to be an enemy." So the children all got close together and walked up to the tree and in behind it, and there, sure enough, they found the beaver. But it still drew back, saying to them in a hoarse and throaty whisper, "Further in. Come further in. Right here. We're not safe in the open." Only when it had led them into the dark spot where 4 trees grew so close together that their boughs met, and the brown earth and the pine needles could be seen underfoot because no snow had fallen there, then it began to talk to them. "Are you sons of Adam and daughters of Eve?" he said. "Well, we're some of them," said Peter. "Shh," said the beaver. "Not so loud, please. We're not safe even here." Why? Who are you so afraid of?" asked Peter. "There's no one here but ourselves." "Oh, there are the trees," said the beaver. "They're always listening. Most of them are on our side, but they are trees that would betray us to her. You know what I mean?" And nodded its head several times. "If it comes to talking about sides," said Edmund, "how do we know that you're a friend?" "Well, not meaning to be rude, but I'm not a stranger." "And quite right," said the beaver. "Here is my token." And with these words he held up to them a little white object. They all looked at it in surprise until suddenly Lucy said, "Oh, of course, that's my handkerchief. The one I gave to poor Mr. Tumnus." "That's right," said the beaver. "Poor fellow. He got wind of the arrest before it actually happened, and he handed this over to me. He said that if anything happened to him, I must meet you here and take you on to—" Here the beaver's voice sank into silence, and it gave one or two mysterious nods. Then, signalling to the children to stand close around, as close as they possibly could, so that their faces were actually tickled by its whiskers, and added in low whispers, "They say Aslan is on the move. Perhaps has already landed." And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was, any more than you do. But the moment the beaver had spoken the words, everybody felt quite different. Perhaps it's sometimes happened to you in a dream, that somebody says something which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if it had some enormous meaning, either a terrifying one which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning, too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life and always wishing you could get into that dream again. It was like that now. At the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump in its inside. Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or delightful strain of music had just floated by. And Lucy got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and realise it's the beginning of the holidays or the beginning of the summer. "And what about Mr. Tumnus?" said Lucy. "Where is he?" "Shh," said the beaver. "Not here. I must bring you where we can have a real talk and also some dinner." No one except Edmund felt any difficulty about trusting the beaver now, and everyone, including Edmund, was very glad to hear the word dinner. And they all hurried along behind their new friend, who led them, unsurprisingly, at a quick pace, and always in the thickest parts of the forest, for over an hour. Everybody was feeling very tired and very hungry, when suddenly the trees began to get thinner in front of them, and the ground began to fall steeply downhill. A minute later they came out under the open sky, the sun was still shining, and found themselves looking down on a fine sight. They were standing on the edge of a steep, narrow valley, and at the bottom of which ran, at least if it had been running, if it wasn't frozen, a fairly large river. Just below them, a dam had been built across this river, and when they saw it, everyone suddenly remembered that, of course, beavers are always making dams, and felt quite sure that Mr. Beaver had made this one. They all noticed that he now had some sort of modest expression on his face, a sort of look people have when you're visiting a garden they've made, or reading a story that they've written. So it was only common politeness when Susan said, "Oh, what a lovely dam!" And Mr. Beaver didn't say hush, but this time he said, merely a trifle. It isn't really finished." And above the dam there was what ought to have been a deep pool, but was now, of course, a level floor of dark green ice. And below the dam, much lower, was more ice, but instead of being smooth, it was all frozen into the foamy and wavy shapes in which water had been rushing along at the very moment the frost came. And when the water had been trickling over and spurting through the dam, there was now a glittering wall of icicles, as if the side of the dam had been covered all over with flowers and wreaths and festoons of the purest sugar. And out in the middle, and partly on top of the dam, was a funny little house shaped like an enormous beehive, and from the hole in the roof smoke was going up, and so that when you saw it, especially if you were hungry, you knew at once, you thought at once, of cooking, and became hungrier than you were before. That was what the others chiefly noticed, but Edmund noticed something else. A little lower down the river, another small river which came down another small valley to join it, and looking up that valley, Edmund could see two small hills, and he was almost sure that they were the two hills which the White Witch had pointed out to him when he parted from her at the lamp-post the other day. And then, between them, he thought, must be her palace between these hills, only a mile off or less, and he thought about Turkish delight, and about being a king. I wonder how Peter will like that, he asked himself, the horrible ideas that came into his head. Here we are, said Mr. Beaver, and it looks as if Mrs. Beaver has been expecting us. I'll lead the way. Be careful, and don't slip. At the top of the dam, it was wide enough to walk on, though not for humans. A very nice place to walk because it was covered with ice, and though the frozen pool was level with it on one side, there was a nasty drop-off to the lower river on the other side. Along this route, Mr. Beaver led them single file right out to the middle where they could look a long way up the river and a long way down it. And then they reached the middle. They were at the door of the house. Here we are, Mrs. Beaver, said Mr. Beaver. I have found them. Here are the sons and the daughters of Adam and Eve. And they all went in. The first thing Lucy noticed as she went in was the burning sound, and the first thing she saw was a kind-looking old she-beaver sitting in the corner with a thread in her mouth, working busily at the sewing machine. And it was from it that the sound came. She stopped her work and got up as soon as the children came in. "Oh, you've come at last," she said, holding out both wrinkled old paws. "At last! To think that I would ever live to see the day. The potatoes are unboiling and the kettle's singing, and I dare say, Mr. Beaver, you'll get us some fish." "Oh, that I will," said Mr. Beaver, and he went out of the house, Peter with him, and across the ice of the deep pool to where he had a little hole in the ice where he kept open every day with his hatchet. They would take a pail with them, and Mr. Beaver sat down quietly on the edge of the hole. He didn't seem to mind being so chilly, and he looked hard at it, and then suddenly shot his paw in, and before you could say Jack Robinson, he had whisked out a beautiful trout. Then he did it all over again until they had a fine catch of fish. Meanwhile, the girls were helping. Mrs. Beaver to fill the kettle and lay the table and cut the bread and put the plates in the oven to heat, and to draw a huge jug of beer for Mr. Beaver from the barrel which stood in the corner of the house, and then to put on the frying pan and get the drippings hot. Lucy thought that Beavers had a very snug little home, though it was not at all like Mr. Tumnus's cave. There were no books or pictures, and instead of beds there were bunks, like on a board ship, built into the wall. And there were hams and strings of onions hanging from the roof, and against the walls were gumboots and oilskins and hatchets and a pair of shears and spades and trowels and things for carrying mortar in, and fishing rods and fishing nets and sacks. And cloth on the table, though very clean, was very rough. Just as the frying pan was nicely hissing, Peter and Mr. Beaver came in with the fish, which Mr. Beaver had already opened with his knife and cleaned out in the open air. You can think how good a new caught fish smelt while they were frying, and how the hungry children longed for them to be done, and how much hungrier still they had become before Mr. Beaver said, "Now, we are nearly ready." Susan drained the potatoes, and then put all of them back in the empty pot to dry on the side of the range, while Lucy was helping Mrs. Beaver dish up the trout, so that in a very few minutes, everybody was drawing up their stools. It was all three-legged stools in the Beaver house, except for Mrs. Beaver's own special rocking chair by the fire, and they were all preparing to enjoy themselves. There was a jug of creamy milk for the children, and Mr. Beaver stuck to the beer, and a great big lump of deep yellow butter in the middle of the table, from which everyone took as much as he wanted to go with his potatoes. And all of the children thought, and I agree with them, that there's nothing to beat good fresh water fish if you eat it when it has been alive half an hour ago and has come out of the pan half a minute ago. And when they had finished the fish, Mrs. Beaver brought unexpectedly out of the oven a great and glorious sticky marmalade roll, steaming hot, and at the same time moved the kettle onto the fire, so that when they had finished the marmalade roll, the tea was made and ready to be poured. When each person had his or her cup of tea, each person shoved his or her stool so as to be able to lean against the wall and give a long sigh of contentment. "And now," said Mr. Beaver, pushing away his empty mug of beer and pulling his cup of tea towards him, "if you'll just wait till I've got my pipe lit up and nicely going, why, now we can get to business. It's snowing again," he added, cocking his eye to the window. "That's all the better, because it means we shan't have any visitors, and if anyone should have been trying to follow you, why, he won't find any tracks." Chapter 8. What happened after dinner? "Now," said Lucy, "do tell us what's happened to Mr. Tumnus." "Ah, that's bad," said the Beaver, shaking his head. "Oh, that's very, very bad business. There's no doubt he was taken off by the police. I got word from a bird who saw it done." "Well, where's he been taken to?" asked Lucy. "Well, they were heading northward when they were last seen, and we all know what that means." "No, we don't," said Susan. Mr. Beaver shook his head in a gloomy fashion. "I'm afraid it means they were taking him to her house," he said. "But what will they do to him, Mr. Beaver?" gasped Lucy. "Well," said Mr. Beaver, "you can't exactly say for sure, but there's not many taken in there that ever comes out again. Statues. It's all full of statues, they say. In the courtyard and up the stairs and in the hall, people she's turned." He paused and shuddered. "Turned into stone." "But Mr. Beaver," said Lucy, can't we, must we do something to save him? It's too dreadful. It's all on my account." "Well, I don't doubt you would save him if you could, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver. "But you've got no chance getting into the house against her will and ever coming out alive." "Well, couldn't we have some sort of stratagem?" said Peter. Couldn't we dress up as something, or pretend to be, peddlers or anything? Or watch till she was gone, until she went out, or hang in there, or there must be some way. This fawn saved my sister at his own risk, Mr. Beaver. We can't just leave him to have that done to him." "Oh, it's no good, son of Adam," said Mr. Beaver. "No good you're trying, of all people. But now that Aslan is on the move—" "Oh, yeah, Tell us about Aslan, said several voices at once. For once again that strange feeling, like the first signs of spring, like a good news had come over them. Who is Aslan? Asked Susan. Aslan? Said the beaver. Why, don't you know? He's the king. He's the lord of the whole wood. But he's not often here, you understand. Never in my time or my father's time. But the word has reached us, he's come back. He's in Narnia at this moment. And he'll settle with the white queen, all right. It's he, not you, that will save Mr. Tumnus. She won't turn him into stone too? Said Edmund. Oh, Lord love you, son of Adam, what a simple thing to say, answered Mr. Beaver with a great laugh. Turn him to stone? If she can't stand on her own 2 feet and look at him in the face, it'll be the most she can do and more than I expect of her. No. He will put all to rights. As it says in the old rhyme in these parts. It goes like this. Wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death. And when he shakes his mane, we will have spring again. You'll understand when you see him. But shall we see him? Asked Susan. Why, daughter of Eve, that's what I brought you here for. I am going to lead you where you shall meet him, said Mr. Beaver. So, is he a man? Asked Lucy. Aslan a man? Said Mr. Beaver. Certainly not. I tell you, he's the king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of beasts? Aslan is a lion. The lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Oh, that you will, dearie. And make no mistake, said Mrs. Beaver. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just silly. Well, then he isn't safe, said Lucy. Safe? Said Mr. Beaver. Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's the king, I tell you. Oh, I'm longing to see him, said Peter, even if I do feel frightened when it comes to the point. Well, that's right, son of Adam, said Mr. Beaver, bringing up his paw onto the table with a crash. It made all of the cups and the saucers rattle. And you shall. Word has been sent that you are to meet him tomorrow, and if you can, at the stone table. Where's that? Asked Lucy. I'll show you, said Mr. Beaver. It's down the river, and a good step from here, and I'll take you to it. But meanwhile, what about poor Mr. Tumnus? Said Lucy. Look, the quickest way you can help Tumnus is by going to meet Aslan, said Mr. Beaver. Once he's with us, then we can begin doing things. Not that we didn't need you to. That's for another of one of those old rhymes. Goes like this. When Adam's flesh and Adam's bone sits at Cair Paravel enthroned, the evil time will be over and done. So things must be drawing near to their end now. He's come and then you've come. We've heard Aslan coming to these parts before, long ago. Nobody can say when, but there's never been any of your race here before. That's what I don't understand, Mr. Beaver, said Peter. I mean, isn't the witch herself human? She'd like us to believe it, said Mr. Beaver. But it's on that she bases her claim to be queen. But she's no daughter of Eve. She comes of your father Adam. Here Mr. Beaver bowed. Your father Adam's first wife. Her they called Lilith, and she was one of the jinn. That's what comes on one side. And on the other, she comes from the giants. No, there isn't a drop of real human blood in the witch. Well, that's why she's bad all through and through, Mr. Beaver, said Mrs. Beaver. True enough, Mrs. Beaver, he replied. There may be two views about humans, meaning no offence to the present company, but there's no two views about things that look like humans and aren't. Well, I've known good dwarfs, said Mrs. Beaver. Oh, so have I, now you come to speak of it, said her husband, but precious few, and they were the ones least like men. But in general, take my advice. When you meet anything that's going to be human and isn't yet, or used to be human once and isn't now, or ought to be human and isn't, you better keep your eye on it and feel for your hatchet. And that's why the witch is always on the lookout for humans in Narnia. She's been watching you this many a year, and if she knew there were 4 of you, she'd be more dangerous still. What's that to do with it? Asked Peter. Because of another prophecy, said Mr. Beaver. Down at Cair Paravel, that's the castle on the sea coast, down at the mouth of the river, which ought to be the capital of the whole country, if all of this was as it should be. Down at Cair Paravel, there are 4 thrones, and it's saying in Narnia, time out of mind, that when 2 sons of Adam and 2 sons of daughters of Eve sit in those 4 thrones, then it will be the end not only of the White Witch's reign, but of her life. And that is why we had to be so cautious when you came along. For if she knew about you 4, your lives would be worth a shake of my whiskers. All the children had been attending and listening so hard to what Mr. Beaver was telling them that they had noticed nothing else for a long time. And then during the moment of silence that followed the last remark, Lucy suddenly said, I say, where's Edmund? There was a dreadful pause, and then everyone began asking, who saw him last? How long has he been missing? Is he outside? And they all rushed to the door and looked out. The snow was falling thickly and steadily, and the green ice of the pool had vanished under the thick white blanket. And from where the little house stood in the centre of the dam, you could hardly see either bank. Out they went, plunging well over their ankles into the soft new snow, and went around the house in every direction. Edmund! Edmund! They called till their voices were hoarse. But the silently falling snow seemed to muffle their voices, and there was not even an echo in the answer. How perfectly dreadful, said Susan as they came back in despair. Oh, how I'd wish we'd never come. What on earth are we to do, Mr. Beaver, said Peter. Do? Said Mr. Beaver, who was already putting on his snow boots. Do? We must be off at once. We haven't a moment to spare. We'd better divide into 4 separate search parties, said Peter, and we'll all go in different directions. Whoever finds him must come back here at once, and... Search parties, son of Adam? Said Mr. Beaver. What for? Well, to look for Edmund, of course. Oh, there's no point looking for him, said Mr. Beaver. What do you mean, said Susan. He can't be far away yet. And we've got to find him. What do you mean when you say there's no use looking for him? The reason there's no use looking for him, said Mr. Beaver, is that we already know where he's gone. Everyone stared in amazement. Don't you understand, said Mr. Beaver. He's gone to her, the White Witch. He has betrayed us all. Oh, surely, oh, really, said Susan, he can't have done that. Can't he? Said the Beaver, looking very hard at the 3 children, and everything they wanted to say died on their lips for each felt suddenly quite certain that this was exactly what Edmund had done. "But he will know the way," said Peter. "He's been to this country before." "Well, has he been here before? Has he ever been here alone?" said Mr. Beaver. "Yes," said Lucy, almost in a whisper. "I'm afraid he has." "And did he tell you what he had done or who he'd met?" "Well, no, he didn't," said Lucy. "Then mark my words," said Mr. Beaver. "He has already met the White Witch and joined her side, and been told where she lives. And I don't like to mention it before, he being your brother and all, but the moment I set eyes on that brother of yours, I said to myself, treacherous. He had a look of one who's been with the witch and eaten her food. You can always tell them, if you've lived long in Narnia, something about their eyes." "All the same," said Peter, rather in a choking sort of voice, we'll still have to go and look for him. He's our brother after all, and even if he's a rather little beast, he's only a kid." "Go to the witch's house?" said Mrs. Beaver. "Don't you see that our only chance of either saving him or yourselves is to keep away from her?" "Well, how do you mean?" said Lucy. "Why, all she wants is to get the four of you. She's thinking all of the time about those 4 thrones at Cair Paravel. Once you were all 4 inside her house, her job would be done, and there'd be 4 new statues in her collection before you had time to speak. She'll keep them as long as she lives, and as long as he's the only one she's got, because she'll want to use him as a decoy, as a bait to catch the rest of you with." "Oh, can no one help us?" asked Lucy. "Only Aslan," said Mr. Beaver. "We must go and meet him. That's our only chance." "It seems to me, my dears," said Mrs. Beaver, "that it's very important to know that just when he slipped away. How much he can tell her depends on how much he heard. For instance, had we started talking of Aslan before he left? If not, then maybe we'll do very well, for she won't know that Aslan has come to Narnia, or that we are meeting him, and will be quite off guard as far as that is concerned." "Well, I don't remember him being here when we were talking about Aslan," began Peter. But Lucy interrupted. "Oh, yes, he was," she said miserably. "Don't you remember? It was he who asked whether the witch could turn Aslan into stone too." "Oh, by Jove, he did," said Peter. "Just the sort of thing he would say too." "Oh, worse," said Mr. Beaver. "And that next thing is this. Was he still here when I told you that the place for meeting Aslan was the stone table?" Of course, no one knew the answer to this, because if he was, continued Mr. Beaver, then she'll simply sledge down that direction and get between us and the stone table and catch us on our way. In fact, we shall be cut off from Aslan. But that isn't what she'll do first," said Mrs. Beaver. "Not if I know her. The moment that Edmund tells her that we're all here, she'll set out to catch us this very night. And if he's been gone about half an hour, she'll be here in about another 20 minutes. "You're right," said Mrs. Beaver. "Let's go," said her husband. "We must all get away from here. There is not a moment to lose." That finishes our reading for this evening. I wonder, will the children and the beavers get to Aslan? Let's find out tomorrow. Good night, everyone.
Well, thanks for joining us, and thank you to HarperCollins Children's Books. As you head into your evening, there's some questions to ponder in the description box below.